Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The sun had begun its slow descent over Lagos Island, spreading a bronze shimmer across the lagoon and stretching long shadows over the bustling streets. The clamor of honking danfos echoed like drums in a crowded festival, each driver fighting for space in the snarl of traffic that moved slower than a snail carrying a sack of yams. Hawkers darted through the cars like restless ants, balancing trays of gala, plantain chips, and chilled sachet water on their heads, calling out prices that rose and fell with the desperation in their voices. Amid this chaos, Maid walked steadily, her handbag tugging against her arm, her office shoes tapping out a rhythm that matched the restless heartbeat of the city. She was neither in a rush nor dragging her feet, for she had mastered the Lagos art of moving like water, flowing past obstacles without being swallowed by them. Her face bore the quiet calm of someone who carried peace even in the storm. She had just left her office on Broad Street, her head still buzzing with the day's work, her eyes slightly dimmed by the harsh glow of the afternoon sun that bounced off glass buildings like fire on mirrors. Unlike many who cursed the day as they trudged home, Maid wore a soft expression, one that drew greetings from familiar faces along the road. She was known in her neighborhood as the kind of woman who remembered names, who lent a listening ear, who often stopped to help even when she herself was weary. But this evening, fate placed her steps on a path that would test both her patience and her trust in ways she had never imagined. At the junction near the old post office, where buses jostled like goats scrambling for feed, stood Mama Tade, a widow whose presence was as noticeable as the smell of roasted corn on a rainy evening. She was leaning heavily on her wooden walking stick, her wrapper tied tightly across her waist, her scarf slightly loosened by the humidity of the night. Time had carved stories on her face, each wrinkle a testimony of battles fought and survived. The woman's eyes, though cloudy with age, still glimmered with an unsettling sharpness like coals hidden under ash. When she spotted Maid weaving her way through the crowd, she raised her free hand slightly, beckoning her to stop. Maid, always respectful of elders, adjusted her handbag, squeezed past a cluster of schoolchildren licking ice cream, and walked toward the old woman. "Good evening, Mama," she greeted warmly, her voice carrying that gentle tone that often melted hearts. But Mama Tade didn't smile. Instead, she gripped her stick tighter, leaning forward as if the weight of what she carried in her chest was too heavy to remain unspoken. "Maid," she whispered, her voice quivering like a leaf caught in the wind, "listen to me carefully tonight. Don't enter any car. I don't care if it's a taxi, or if it's someone you know, or if it's a stranger smiling with all his teeth. Walk if you must, take the bus if you have no choice, but don't enter a car." Her tone carried a kind of urgency that made the din of Lagos fade for a brief second, as though the city itself leaned in to hear her words. The young woman blinked, her lips parting in surprise. She knew Mama Tade's reputation well. In their community, the widow was regarded with both reverence and suspicion. Some said her dreams carried messages from beyond, that she often woke from the night with visions too heavy for ordinary tongues to speak. Others dismissed her as a lonely old woman whose mind had been weathered by sorrow. But one thing no one could deny was that her warnings, when ignored, often found strange fulfillment. Maid remembered how 2 years ago, Mama Tade had told a neighbor not to travel to Ibadan on a certain Friday, urging him to delay his journey by a day. He had laughed it off, mocking her in the beer parlor that evening. By Saturday morning, word spread that the bus he had taken on Friday had collided with a trailer on the expressway, leaving no survivors. That story had lingered like smoke, never fully dispersing from the minds of those who lived nearby. Yet, standing before the widow now, Maid could not fully surrender herself to fear. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Mama, the buses are always full at this hour, and you know how Lagos traffic is. A car would be faster. Don't worry, I'll be fine." She spoke lightly, but deep inside, something tugged uneasily at her chest, like a drumbeat out of rhythm. Mama Tade's face tightened, and her voice rose slightly, drawing a few curious stares from passers-by. "Don't joke with me, Maid. I saw it before the sun rose today. I saw you in a car, and the car did not stop where it should. The night was heavy, the road was dark, and your heart was beating like a bird in a hunter's grip. If I didn't warn you, my spirit would never rest." She pressed her hand against Maid's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong for a woman her age. For a moment, The air between them thickened, as though invisible threads of warning tied them together. Maud felt a chill snake up her spine despite the humid air. She wanted to laugh it off, to wave her hand and say Mama was just tired and imagining things. But the widow's eyes bored into hers with such intensity that words caught in her throat. Around them, Lagos continued its restless dance. Hawkers shouting prices, conductors banging on the sides of buses, lovers arguing on the sidewalk. Yet for Maud, time seemed to slow, and all she could hear was the widow's shaky breath and the echo of her words. "Don't enter the car." She finally nodded, forcing a smile to reassure the old woman, though her mind was clouded with thoughts. With a polite farewell, she adjusted her bag, promised she would be careful, and continued toward the bus stop, carrying the widow's warning like a stone lodged deep in her chest. The sky over Lagos wore the color of dying embers, a soft orange glow sinking behind skyscrapers that seemed to pierce the heavens. The bustle of the city was at its loudest. Conductors clung to bus doors yelling destinations like town criers, while impatient drivers leaned on their horns as though the sound alone could part the sea of traffic. Maud stood at the edge of the road, clutching her handbag tightly, the weight of exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. She had spent the day balancing deadlines at the office and errands afterward, and now all she wanted was the warmth of her small apartment in Surrey, a quiet corner where she could breathe after the chaos of the city. But the buses that screeched to a halt before her were already bursting at the seams, with passengers crammed so tightly their faces pressed against glass. Even the taxis seemed uninterested in stopping, their drivers raising hands to signal they were occupied, disappearing into the blur of taillights. The air was thick with the smell of roasted corn, exhaust fumes, and the restless energy of Lagos itself, a city that, despite its noise and bustle, could suddenly feel as lonely as a desert. She shifted her feet, her shoes biting into her skin after the long day, and sighed. Each passing moment brought Mama Tade's strange warning back to her mind, circling like a hawk in the distance. "Don't enter the car," the widow had said, her eyes cloudy with something that looked more like fear than madness. At first, Maud had brushed it off, telling herself that Lagos was too practical, too busy a place for such mystical talk. Yet here she was, stranded on a street where the night was beginning to stretch its fingers, and the thought of walking the entire way home through alleys and side streets felt like punishment for sins she had never committed. She glanced around once more, hoping a bus would miraculously arrive empty, but Lagos was not a city of miracles. It was a city of bargains, chance, and moments that could turn in the blink of an eye. She was still standing there when the black car rolled up, its engine purring softly, too smooth, too elegant compared to the battered Danfos and yellow cabs she was used to. It was the kind of car that seemed slightly out of place on that street, the kind reserved for corporate executives or government officials, not for strangers offering lifts. The window slid down effortlessly, and from inside came a warm, deep voice that carried with it a rhythm too polished for the streets. "Good evening, miss," the man greeted, his words cushioned with charm. Maud turned her head, her tired eyes meeting his. He looked like someone who belonged to the city's business districts, his shirt neatly ironed, a wristwatch gleaming faintly under the streetlight, his smile trained but not overdone. "You look tired," he continued, his voice steady like water flowing over stones. "Where are you heading? I can give you a ride." The offer hung in the air like the smell of rain before a storm. Maud hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. Lagos was no stranger to stories of people who entered cars and never reached their destinations. Yet, there was something disarming about the way he looked at her, not with the sharp eyes of a predator, but with the easy assurance of someone used to being trusted. His name, he said, was David, and he had recently relocated to Lagos for work. He gestured casually to the seat beside him, as though he was doing nothing more dangerous than offering a spare chair at a dinner table. Maud's heart tugged in two directions. One part screamed that Mama Tade's warning was too fresh, too heavy to ignore. The other whispered that she had walked this city long enough to know kindness when she saw it, that perhaps she was overthinking. The buses were not slowing down, her legs ached, and her home felt like a distant dream. She lingered in silence, weighing every glance, every movement, while the city around her carried on with its impatient rhythm. Her hesitation did not go unnoticed, for David leaned a little closer, his tone softening like someone speaking to a skittish child. "Please don't be worried. I drive this route every day. You'll be safe. Lagos is too stressful to waste your energy walking when someone can help." The words were wrapped in comfort, but they also carried a subtle urgency, as though he wanted her decision before she could think twice. Maid studied him again. The smoothness of his skin, the deliberate way he spoke, the faint smell of cologne drifting from the car. Everything about him seemed rehearsed, like a melody played too perfectly. And yet, when her eyes darted back to the road, where buses thundered past like charging bulls, she felt the sharp sting of fatigue press harder on her bones. The thought of squeezing into a danfo where she would stand for nearly an hour, crushed between strangers, made her stomach twist. Perhaps, she thought, this man was nothing more than what he appeared, a professional returning home, offering kindness to a stranger. After all, even in Lagos, where everyone had their guard up, there were still people who helped without strings attached. She told herself that the widow's warning was nothing more than a coincidence, the ramblings of an old woman whose words carried shadows where there were none. Against the voice of her instincts, she let reason take the wheel. With a faint nod and a weary smile, she reached for the car door and slipped inside. As it closed with a soft thud, the city's noise suddenly seemed muted, as though she had crossed into another world entirely. The car smelled faintly of leather, its seats smooth under her palms. Outside, Lagos still moved at its relentless pace, but inside there was a cocoon-like silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of the tires against the road. David adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking briefly to her reflection, then back to the road with the ease of someone in control. "You live in Suralere, yes?" he asked, his voice casual. Maid nodded, her throat suddenly dry. He smiled again, that same trained curve of lips that seemed both reassuring and unreadable. "That's on my way," he said simply, as though the decision had always been inevitable. The car moved smoothly, gliding past buses that screeched and stalled like tired animals. Maid sat stiffly at first, her fingers curled around the strap of her handbag. But slowly, the comfort of the ride began to seep in. The air conditioner whispered cool air against her skin, the seat cushioned her back, and for the first time that day, she wasn't standing or rushing or pushing against the current of the city. David began to talk, small things at first. He asked about her work, her family, her interests. His voice carried no edge, no impatience, just an easy rhythm that made conversation flow like a quiet stream. Maid answered cautiously, her words careful, her guard half raised. She did not tell him much, but enough to keep the silence from swallowing them. Yet, in the corner of her mind, Mama Tade's warning fluttered like a trapped bird. She told herself it was nothing, that the widow's strange visions belonged to another world. Here, in the heart of Lagos, logic ruled. And yet, even as she allowed herself to relax slightly, something about David's eyes in the mirror lingered, something she couldn't quite place, like a note played off-key in an otherwise perfect song. The car glided smoothly away from the busy streetlights of Lagos Island, and for a moment, Maid thought she had made the right decision. The exhaustion that had wrapped around her ankles like invisible chains began to loosen as she leaned back in the seat. She could still see the reflection of neon signs on shop windows as they zipped past, and the buzz of okadas weaving recklessly between cars filled the night air like a restless choir. David's voice was calm, soft even, as he asked about her work and whether she had grown up in Lagos or moved here like so many others chasing opportunities. Maid answered politely, giving short responses, never quite turning her body fully toward him. Her instincts told her to keep some distance, even though she had already chosen the convenience of his car over the sweat and suffocation of a danfo. She told him she worked in an office on Broad Street, doing administrative duties, and sometimes dreamt of owning a small boutique. He chuckled lightly, telling her dreams were what made life in Lagos worth the struggle. His words floated smoothly, but beneath the rhythm of his voice, she caught an undertone, something almost too polished, like a man rehearsing lines for a play. She brushed the thought aside, convincing herself she was simply being paranoid. She looked outside the window and noticed how quickly the familiar sights were disappearing. The roads they were now on looked quieter, wider, less crowded with pedestrians, and that alone unsettled her. Lagos was never this silent at this hour, and silence, in a city that prided itself on noise, felt almost like a warning drum that no one else could hear but her. She adjusted her handbag on her lap and glanced at him again. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that revealed nothing, like the painted grin of a mask hiding whatever lurked underneath. "You live in Suralere, right?" he asked casually, his tone carrying a hint of familiarity, though she was sure she hadn't told him exactly where she stayed. Her throat went dry, but she managed to nod slightly, not wanting to reveal the anxiety beginning to claw at her. "Yes," she replied softly, "I do." He nodded knowingly, his eyes still fixed on the road. "I have friends in Suralere. I know all the back roads. Tonight, I'll take you there faster than any bus or taxi could." His words were meant to reassure, but they landed in her chest like stones. She wanted to believe him, yet the city's rhythm had changed around them. The rush of traffic, the calls of vendors, the blaring music from roadside bars, all of it seemed to have faded behind them, swallowed by the growing emptiness of the streets they were now driving through. She shifted slightly in her seat, her palms dampening against her handbag. Every instinct inside her whispered that this was not the route home. She told herself to speak up, to demand he turn back toward the busier roads, but the words stuck in her throat like fish bones. Fear, she realized, didn't always come crashing in suddenly like thunder. Sometimes it crept slowly like a shadow growing longer as the sun dipped, until the darkness was complete. Minutes stretched, and with every turn of the car, she felt herself slipping deeper into unfamiliar territory. She knew Lagos was full of hidden shortcuts, but none of the roads they were on looked like paths that led to Suralere. Instead of crowded streets lined with mama-put stalls and Okadas parked in a line, these roads were littered with half-finished buildings, deserted shops, and stretches of wall sprayed with faded graffiti. A stray dog darted across the road, and David chuckled lightly, muttering something about how animals ruled the city at night. Maid forced a small laugh, her voice trembling like dry leaves in the harmattan wind. She wanted to believe his light tone, but her mind was already racing. Mama Tade's voice from earlier that evening returned uninvited, echoing in her head with painful clarity, "Don't enter the car." Her fingers clutched the handle of her bag, so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. She tried to calm herself, telling her mind she was overthinking it, that not every warning from an old widow was a prophecy, but the doubt refused to leave. The car slowed as David maneuvered past a pothole, and in that moment, she noticed something chilling. He had not once asked her for proper directions. He had never said, "Show me where to turn," or "Point me to your street." He drove with the assurance of a man who already had a destination in mind, one that might not have been hers. She swallowed hard and finally summoned the courage to speak. "Excuse me, David," she said softly, almost too softly. "This isn't the way I normally go home. My house is in the opposite direction." He glanced at her briefly, his lips curving into that same unfaltering smile. "Relax, Maid," he replied smoothly, his voice a river flowing calmly, even as it carried her deeper into the unknown. "This is Lagos. There are 100 ways to reach one place. The buses only use the crowded roads because they don't know any better. Trust me, you'll be home soon." The way he said it, "Trust me," sent a chill crawling down her spine. Trust, in a city like Lagos, was a coin you spent carefully, for once it was gone, it rarely returned. She wanted to press him further, to insist he turn back to the main road, but her voice caught again, held hostage by a mixture of fear and politeness. Instead, she looked out of the window, her heart pounding as the car drove deeper into the shadows of the city. Streetlights grew sparse, and the hum of life that Lagos carried even in the dead of night seemed to have abandoned this part of town. She felt like a lone traveler in a story, whose ending was being rewritten by forces beyond her control. The once friendly stranger beside her no longer felt like a helper. He felt like a storm building silently over the horizon, ready to break when she least expected. The car crawled deeper into the quiet parts of Lagos, where even the sound of traffic seemed to have lost its courage. Maid sat stiffly, her hands locked around her handbag, as though it was the only anchor she had left in this growing storm. The road was narrower now, lined with tall walls that looked like they hid more secrets than they revealed, and every flickering streetlight seemed to cast shadows that stretched unnaturally long. Her throat felt dry, her voice trapped, and though her mind screamed at her to speak, her lips refused to move. David drove in silence, his jaw clenched, and his earlier warmth had vanished like mist under the morning sun. The silence inside the car was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional sound of tires bumping over potholes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge that froze her blood. "You trust too easily, Maid," he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "In this city, a girl like you should be more careful. Not everyone means well." His words slithered into her ears like a serpent, each syllable dripping with something she could not name. She wanted to ask him what he meant, to confront him, but her fear was a hand tightening around her throat. Instead, she turned her eyes to the window, hoping that the world outside could offer her an escape, but all she saw was darkness and emptiness. The Lagos she knew, the noise, the chaos, the life was gone. She was in a part of the city where silence reigned, and silence in Lagos was rarely ever safe. The car slowed near a stretch of abandoned warehouses, their walls coated in graffiti, their gates rusted, their emptiness loud. Somewhere in the distance, a generator coughed to life, then fell silent again, like even the machines had no strength left to fight the night. Maid's heart was thundering in her chest, so loud she thought it might betray her fear to him. David parked briefly by the roadside and turned to face her, his smile replaced with a smirk that didn't bother to hide its cruelty. "Do you see how quiet it is here?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. "No one to stop us. No one to hear." His eyes bore into her, stripping away whatever calm she had left. She reached for the door handle instinctively, pulling at it with all her strength, but the door was locked, as if mocking her desperation. Her palms grew slippery with sweat, her breathing uneven. The walls of the car felt as though they were closing in, suffocating her. For the first time, she truly felt like prey, caught in a trap carefully laid out by someone who had studied every step she would take. Her mind returned to Mama Tade's warning, "Don't enter the car." The words now cut through her like a blade, cruel in their truth. She thought of her home in Suralire, of her small room filled with warmth and safety, and the gulf between there and here felt like the span between heaven and hell. David reached into the glove compartment, his movements deliberate, and pulled out a small piece of cloth. He didn't say what it was for, but his actions said enough. Panic surged through her veins like fire, her body screaming at her to act before the night sealed her fate. Maid's trembling hands searched desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. Her bag, heavy with files and groceries, was the only thing within reach. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles whitening, her eyes darting between David's hands and the locked doors. Her heartbeat was so loud it seemed to echo in her ears, drowning out every other sound. Lagos, the city of noise, felt eerily quiet around her, as though the city itself had abandoned her to whatever fate awaited. David leaned closer, his voice dropping lower, like a whisper carried by a poisonous wind. "No one will believe you if you scream here," he murmured. "This place is forgotten, just like the people who end up in it." The casual cruelty of his words shook her more than the darkness outside. She tightened her grip on her bag, and in a burst of courage she didn't know she possessed, she swung it at him, the force surprising even herself. Papers spilled, groceries scattered, and the sound of metal hitting his arm filled the car. David winced, momentarily thrown off, but the smirk returned to his lips like a mask that could not be peeled away. "Feisty," he muttered, his tone mocking. "But it won't help you." She reached again for the door handle, tugging, begging silently for it to open, but it refused. The walls of the car seemed to laugh at her, their metal skeleton holding her captive as though they had sworn allegiance to him. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one sharper than the last, and tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She knew if she broke completely, if she surrendered her spirit, she would be lost. Somewhere deep inside, a stubborn flame flickered, refusing to be extinguished, even as fear tried to smother it. David restarted the engine and drove slowly, his silence now more frightening than his words. The road ahead stretched like an endless corridor of shadows, and Maid felt as though each passing second was dragging her deeper into the mouth of something she could not escape. Her mind raced with thoughts of her family, her friends, even the little children who played football on her street, ordinary faces that now felt like distant memories from another life. She imagined never seeing them again, never walking under the Lagos sun with its scorching heat, never hearing the hawkers shout, "Pure water, 50 naira." She imagined becoming a story whispered in the city, another nameless tragedy swallowed by the noise of Lagos and forgotten by morning. But even as despair pressed on her like a heavy stone, that small flame within her refused to die. She sat up straighter, her eyes fixed on the road, her hands clenched into fists. If this was the end, she thought, she would not meet it quietly. She would not hand herself over like a lamb. Somewhere in the shadows of the city, she prayed silently that fate, or God, or perhaps the city itself, would send her a sign. And as the car turned into yet another empty street, she saw something in the distance. A pair of headlights cutting through the darkness, approaching faster than she expected. Her heart leapt, not with relief yet, but with hope, fragile and trembling, like a bird taking flight after being caged too long. The headlights grew brighter with each passing second, stretching long beams of light that cut through the darkness like blades of silver. Maid's breath caught in her throat as she clung to that fragile hope, unsure whether it was salvation drawing near or another shadow about to devour her. The car behind honked once, twice, a sharp sound that cracked the heavy silence like a whip across bare skin. David muttered under his breath, his grip on the steering wheel tightening, his jaw clenching with irritation. "Busybody," he hissed, as though the very idea of another soul interrupting his plan was an insult. But the vehicle behind didn't slow down. Instead, it surged forward, closing the distance until its headlights bathed the black car in a harsh glow. The road, once empty and forgotten, suddenly felt alive again, charged with energy, as if the city itself had opened its eyes. David pulled abruptly to the side, braking hard, his fingers drumming nervously against the wheel. Maide's heart thundered like battered drums in her chest, her pulse rushing in her ears, every beat louder than the last. The other car screeched to a halt just behind them, its headlights still glaring, and before Maide could even draw her next shaky breath, a tall figure stepped out, holding a flashlight that sliced through the gloom like a sword. Mide? The voice was familiar, strong, full of disbelief and recognition at the same time. She blinked, her tears blurring the figure, but the moment the name left his lips, her soul seemed to leap toward it. Tosin, she whispered, though the sound barely escaped her throat. He walked closer, the beam of his flashlight landing directly on her face, and when he saw her wide, tear-streaked eyes, his own features hardened. What are you doing here? Are you all right? His tone carried alarm, not curiosity, a demand for truth rather than a polite question. David leaned across the seat, his lips curling into a forced smile, his voice sliding out as smoothly as oil spilled on water. She's fine, he said quickly. We were just talking. I'm giving her a ride home. But the crack in his performance was clear, and Tosin wasn't fooled. He moved closer, his shoulders squared, his jaw set like a man ready for a fight. The city around them seemed to hold its breath, the warehouses standing like silent witnesses, the broken lampposts casting fractured light over a scene balanced on the knife edge of fate. Maide could feel her own heartbeat pressing against her ribcage, begging her to speak, begging her to tell Tosin the truth before the chance slipped away forever. Her voice came out in fragments, trembling, but strong enough to shatter the mask David had tried to wear. He wasn't taking me home, she said, her words spilling with desperation. He drove me away from Suralire. He locked the doors. Her voice cracked, but the unfinished sentence was heavy enough to fill the night. Tosin's eyes blazed, his flashlight fixed on David's face. Is that true? He asked, his voice low, dangerous, carrying the weight of a man who would not be toyed with. David laughed, a hollow, brittle sound that rang false. She's confused. She must be tired. You know how Lagos nights can mess with people. His hand moved slightly toward the gear, his eyes flickering nervously toward the road ahead. But Tosin's presence was a wall he could not simply drive through. Step out, Tosin ordered, his tone sharp, commanding, the voice of someone who had carried authority in classrooms and now wielded it here in the dark streets. Maide's hand shot to the lock, and with trembling urgency she pulled at it until the door clicked open. The sound was sweeter to her ears than any song she had ever heard. She shoved the door wide, stumbling out into the night air, her legs shaky but her spirit rising as though someone had untied a rope around her neck. She ran straight into Tosin's arms, collapsing against his chest, her tears wetting his shirt, her sobs muffled against him. Thank you, she whispered over and over, each repetition breaking apart like waves against rocks. Tosin held her firmly, one arm steady around her shoulder, his other hand still holding the flashlight like a weapon aimed at the man who had tried to steal her peace. David cursed under his breath, his mask of charm now shattered completely. His eyes darted between them, then back toward the empty stretch of road. He knew the game was up. His smirk vanished, replaced with raw frustration. He slammed the gear into drive, his tires screeching against the broken asphalt as he sped off into the darkness. The black car vanished quickly, swallowed by Lagos's endless veins of roads and shadows, leaving only the echo of burning rubber and a trail of dust behind. Maide clung to Tosin, her body trembling, her knees weak, the realization of how close she had come to destruction pressing down on her like a weight too heavy to carry. Tosin stroked her hair gently, his voice low but firm. You're safe now. He won't hurt you. I've got you. His words were steady, solid, the opposite of David's slippery promises. For the first time since she entered the car, Maide allowed herself to believe safety was within reach. The city hummed again in the distance, the faint honk of a danfo, the bark of a dog, the chatter of people in the far-off streets, as though life was slowly creeping back into the night. But for Maide, this road would never again be just another forgotten stretch of Lagos. It had become the place where fear nearly claimed her, and where salvation found her in the shape of an old friend's steady hand and unshakable courage. She leaned heavily against Tosin, drawing strength from the solid reality of his presence, as the ghost of Mama Tade's warning whispered once more through her mind. Don't enter the car. The drive back towards Surulere felt like a journey through two different cities, the one alive with noise and neon lights, and the other weighed down by shadows that clung stubbornly to the corners of the streets. Tosin's car hummed softly beneath them, its steady movement a sharp contrast to the chaos that still echoed inside Maid's chest. She sat pressed against the passenger seat, her fingers gripping her handbag, as though letting go of it would unravel the fragile calm she had regained. The air inside the car was thick, heavy with unspoken words, yet Tosin's presence carried a quiet strength that seeped into her like balm. He didn't bombard her with questions, nor did he rush her to explain. He simply drove, his hand steady on the wheel, his gaze flicking to the mirrors every few seconds, as though he half expected the black car to reappear from the shadows. The city around them was loud again, the blaring horns of impatient drivers, the cries of street vendors still lingering at midnight, the thrum of generators battling the darkness. But to Maid, each sound felt distant, muted, like she was watching the world through a pane of glass. Her heart still raced, her body still trembled, and yet she was breathing, still breathing, and that itself felt like a miracle. Every few moments, she closed her eyes, whispering silent prayers of gratitude, clinging to the truth that she was alive, that she had not been swallowed by the night. When Tosin finally spoke, his voice was measured, low, like a man careful not to disturb fragile porcelain. You don't have to talk if you're not ready, he said, his eyes still fixed on the road. But know this, whatever he meant to do, you escaped it. You're stronger than you realize. The words struck something deep inside her, and she found herself releasing a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. I should have listened, she whispered, her voice shaky, almost breaking. Mama Tade, she told me. She told me not to enter the car. I laughed it off. I thought she was just being dramatic. If you hadn't come, her words trailed, and her throat tightened with tears she fought hard to hold back. Tosin reached across briefly, his hand brushing against hers, firm but gentle. Don't carry the weight of his choices on your shoulders, he replied softly. That man was a predator. The fault is his, not yours. Remember that. You trusted because you have a good heart, not because you were foolish. His words wrapped around her like a shield, but guilt still nipped at her edges. She nodded faintly, staring out of the window as they crossed a busy roundabout, the lights of kiosks glowing like little beacons in the night. She thought of how easily her life could have been reduced to whispers, how her face might have become a story carried by gossip in the city's buses and beer parlors. That thought alone made her shiver. She squeezed her handbag tighter and whispered another silent prayer, this one for Mama Tade, the woman whose strange warning now carried the weight of prophecy. The closer they drew to Surulere, the more familiar the city became again. The streets no longer looked like empty mouths waiting to swallow her whole. They were once more filled with the life she knew. Okadas darting like fireflies, music spilling from roadside bars, children still chasing each other despite the lateness of the hour. Each sound, each sight, felt like a thread weaving her back into the fabric of the world she belonged to. Tosin slowed as they approached her street, and there, on the small veranda of a worn but sturdy building, stood Mama Tade. She was leaning on her walking stick, her wrapper tied firmly around her waist, her eyes fixed on the road as though she had known the exact moment they would arrive. Maid's chest tightened, and tears slipped freely down her cheeks. When Tosin pulled over, she stepped out slowly, her knees still weak, her soul still trembling. Mama Tade's gaze met hers, sharp yet tender, and though the old woman said nothing at first, her silence spoke louder than words. It was the silence of someone who had seen the storm before it came, who had screamed at the winds, and who now bore witness to the survivor who had crawled out of it. Maid walked toward her slowly, each step heavier than the last, and when she finally reached her, Mama Tade's wrinkled hand reached out, resting gently on her shoulder. You are home, the widow murmured finally, her voice carrying both relief and reproach. The city tried to take you, but God returned you. That night, when she finally lay on her small bed inside her room, the hum of Lagos outside her window felt both comforting and haunting. Every honk of a horn, every shout in the distance, every sputter of a generator reminded her of the thin line between ordinary life and disaster. She replayed the evening in her mind again and again, each memory sharp as broken glass. David's smile, his false kindness, the turned-down unfamiliar streets, the way her hands had trembled on the locked door, the cruel words he spoke in the shadows, and finally, the beam of headlights that announced Tosin's arrival. Each fragment carried its own weight, its own scar. Yet woven through all of it was something stronger than fear, an unshakable lesson. Trust, she realized, was a currency too expensive to hand over cheaply, especially in a city like Lagos where predators wore polished shoes and soft smiles. She drifted between wakefulness and sleep, her heart still heavy but alive with gratitude. In the stillness of her room, with the city singing its restless lullaby beyond her walls, one phrase returned again, steady, unyielding, etched forever into the marrow of her bones. Don't enter the car. Life in the city can be as dazzling as it is dangerous. Not every smile is genuine, and not every helping hand is safe. May this story remind us all to trust our instincts, to value our safety above convenience, and to never ignore the quiet warnings life places in our path. May your journeys be safe, and may no evil eyes find you. May your feet never walk into danger, and may your voice never be silenced in distress. May friends appear for you at the exact moment you need them most, and may every trap laid before you be scattered before you reach it. Your days will be filled with peace, your nights with rest, and your future with hope. And so I say, may it be so. And if you believe, let me hear you say, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.